The boy who would become Holy Roman Emperor Rudolf II entered the world not as a destined ruler, but as a nervous pawn in a dynastic game that rarely favored the emotionally sensitive. Born on the 18th of July 153 in Vienna, Rudolf was the eldest son of Emperor Maximilian II, and Maria of Spain, linking him to both the liberal humanism of the Austrian Habsburgs and the staunch religious orthodoxy of the Spanish crown. But it was the Spanish influence that proved formative. At the age of 11, Rudolf was sent with his younger brother Ernest to the court of his maternal uncle Philip II of Spain. The decision was less about affection and more about power politics. Philip, one of the most inflexible monarchs of the age, believed deeply in Catholic absolutism and sought to mold Rudolf into a monarch cast in the Spanish mold. The Escorial Palace, where Rudolf spent much of his formative years, reflected Philip's worldview, cold, austere, and suffocating in its religiosity. Life in the palace was dominated by ritual silence and repression, an atmosphere ill-suited for a child already predisposed to introspection. Education at the Spanish court emphasized theology and obedience over inquiry and imagination. Tutors drilled the boys in Latin Catholic doctrine and the political sciences, but there was little room for creative or emotional development. Any hint of personal individuality was treated as dangerous eccentricity. By all accounts, Rudolf internalized the Spanish sense of duty and rigidity, but he also grew increasingly withdrawn. He developed traits that would later plague his rule: a fear of betrayal, an obsession with secrecy, and a preference for solitude. Rudolf's emotional instability became apparent in adolescence. While Ernest adapted to the demands of court life, Rudolf oscillated between manic enthusiasm and periods of intense melancholy. He was often described as brilliant but unpredictable, capable of quoting scripture one day and retreating into brooding silence the next. These behaviors, while not yet alarming, indicated a mind that strained under the pressures of royal expectation. The political situation in Europe was deteriorating rapidly during Rudolf's youth. The Protestant Reformation had fragmented Christendom, and the Catholic monarchs of Europe, especially Philip II, saw themselves as guardians of a threatened spiritual order. The Habsburgs, split between their Austrian and Spanish branches, were caught in the struggle to maintain unity amid rising sectarian tensions. In this ideological battleground, Rudolf was expected to act as a bridge, a unifier who could reconcile power and faith. Upon returning to Vienna in his early 20s, Rudolf was viewed with both hope and uncertainty. His education was impeccable, his bloodline unimpeachable, but his personality remained elusive. He did not seek the spotlight, avoided marriage, and showed little interest in military matters. His interests lay elsewhere: astronomy, horology, painting, and, more controversially, alchemy. His father, Emperor Maximilian II, had pursued a moderate religious policy favoring compromise over confrontation between Catholics and Protestants. But Rudolf, shaped by Philip's uncompromising worldview, viewed tolerance as weakness. This ideological rigidity, combined with psychological fragility, would set the stage for a reign marked by both brilliance and dysfunction. When Maximilian II died in 1576, Rudolf was 24. The imperial elector, seeing no better candidate and pressured by the dynastic imperatives of the Habsburg house, confirmed him as King of the Romans, the title held by the heir to the Holy Roman Empire. The actual imperial title would come 3 years later, but the path was now set. Europe had gained a new monarch, one whose mind would gradually spiral into obsession and delusion. Even at the outset of his rule, observers noted Rudolf's odd behavior. He displayed erratic sleeping patterns, sometimes conducting business at midnight and refusing audiences for days. He developed superstitions, consulted astrologers for daily decisions, and surrounded himself with exotic objects and strange advisors. These were not yet signs of madness, but they hinted at a ruler less grounded in the practicalities of governance than in a personal search for meaning in an age of uncertainty. Rudolf's childhood and early adult life had left him ill-prepared for leadership in a fragmented empire. His personality, forged in the rigid confines of the Escorial and marred by early psychological stress, did not naturally lend itself to diplomacy, war, or the political theater required of a Holy Roman Emperor. Still, there was promise of potential for enlightened rule if balanced by wise counsel and strong alliances. But as history would show, the pressures of empire would deepen rather than correct his eccentricities. What began as a temperament shaped by repression and expectation would evolve into a reign haunted by fear, dominated by arcane studies and ultimately eclipsed by dynastic betrayal. Rudolf's rise was quiet, uncertain, and the seeds of chaos had already been sown. Rudolf's ascension to the throne of the Holy Roman Empire in 1579 marked the beginning of a reign that many hoped would restore Habsburg prestige across a fractured Europe. Yet even as the imperial crown passed to him, Rudolf appeared hesitant, almost burdened by the responsibilities of rule. His coronation in Regensburg was carried out with the required ceremony, but the man at its center seemed detached, as if already preoccupied by matters far removed from courtly rituals and imperial administration. At first glance, Rudolf's reign promised continuity. He inherited a realm facing familiar problems, religious divisions deepened by the Reformation, political decentralization in the empire's patchwork of principalities, and the looming threat of the Ottoman Empire to the southeast. But unlike his father, Maximilian II, who had carefully maintained a policy of religious conciliation, Rudolf quickly abandoned moderation. He leaned decisively into Catholic orthodoxy, aligning more closely with the Jesuits and embracing counter-Reformation ideals. His rigid stance alienated Protestant princes, unraveling what little unity remained within the imperial court. Politically, Rudolf proved indecisive. He hesitated to confront the empire's mounting crises and delegated authority erratically, while some advisors like Bishop Melchior Klesel sought to steer him toward active governance. Rudolf often retreated into private quarters, increasingly reliant on astrologers, court painters, and foreign curiosities for solace. The imperial chancery functioned but without clear direction. Counselors came and went, uncertain whether the emperor would issue decrees or ignore their petitions entirely. Even his choice of residence revealed a drift from conventional rulership. In 1583, Rudolf relocated his court from Vienna to Prague, an unusual move at the time. While Vienna was the administrative heart of the Habsburg monarchy, Prague represented something different, a city rich in history, strategically situated, but above all malleable. Within its walls, Rudolf envisioned not just a political capital, but a sanctuary for the arts, sciences, and metaphysics. It was here that his reign would take on its most distinctive and strange character. In Prague, Rudolf began assembling what would become one of the most eclectic and ambitious courts in early modern Europe. Rather than military leaders or seasoned diplomats, he surrounded himself with artists, astrologers, collectors, and self-proclaimed alchemists. The court painter Giuseppe Arcimboldo depicted Rudolf with fruit and flowers, an image both flattering and surreal, mirroring the emperor's fascination with transformation and mystery. The polymath Tycho Brahe and his assistant Johannes Kepler would later be brought to Prague as Rudolf tried to turn his court into the intellectual nucleus of the Christian world. But while Prague flourished as a center for esoteric learning and artistic innovation, the rest of the empire suffered from neglect. Conflicts in the Netherlands, tensions with the Ottoman Empire, and the growing defiance of Protestant states received inconsistent attention from the imperial court. The empire's finances faltered. Corruption spread as local princes grew emboldened by Rudolf's disengagement. More troubling was the emperor's increasing paranoia. He began to see threats everywhere, from foreign spies to court conspirators, even among family members. He conducted private investigations into imagined plots and kept layers of his bureaucracy intentionally isolated from one another. He rarely left the confines of Prague Castle and surrounded himself with guards, whose loyalty he tested obsessively. Despite these precautions, his grasp on power slowly weakened, particularly in Austria and Hungary, where his brother Archduke Matthias began building an alternative power base. The contradiction at the heart of Rudolf's reign grew sharper. While he fancied himself a philosopher king, he failed to address the administrative decay overtaking his empire. He supported bold astronomical studies like Kepler's work on planetary motion, yet refused to organize meaningful defense strategies against Turkish incursions. He patronized the arts with great zeal but alienated both Protestants and moderate Catholics by pursuing a hardline religious policy that fueled unrest. Indeed, Rudolf's support for the Catholic League and his pushback against the Protestant Union only accelerated the polarization of the empire. While he remained ensconced in Prague, believing himself the center of a new renaissance, the Holy Roman Empire was inching closer to irreparable fragmentation. And yet despite, or perhaps because of this imbalance, his court attracted some of the most brilliant and bizarre minds in Europe. Alchemists promised him the philosopher's stone. Magicians performed experiments with magnetism and mirrors. Artisans brought automata and mechanical curiosities from across the continent. Rudolf invested heavily in expanding his Kunstkammer, a cabinet of wonders that included mummified animals, intricate clocks, meteorites, and anatomical models. The emperor's interests were not purely decorative. He viewed these objects as keys to understanding the divine order of the universe. His fascination with the occult was not simply madness or whimsy, it was part of a larger worldview that saw hidden patterns and transcendent logic in the material world. In this, Rudolf mirrored the anxieties of a century in transition, a world caught between medieval mysticism and the emerging rigor of modern science. Still, the emperor's retreat into arcane pursuits came at a cost. His erratic engagement with imperial governance opened space for internal power struggles, particularly among his own relatives. The court in Prague became both a center of brilliance and a vortex of dysfunction, and as Rudolf's mental health deteriorated further, it became increasingly clear that the emperor's grip on reality and on power was slipping. He had been made emperor not by ambition but by dynastic necessity. Now his reluctance to rule was morphing into incapacity. What began as eccentricity hardened into instability, and the consequences for the Habsburg Empire would soon become undeniable. By the mid-1580s, the imperial court in Prague had grown into one of the strangest and most intriguing power centers in Europe. It no longer resembled the austere courts of Vienna or Madrid. Rudolf II had repurposed Prague Castle into a labyrinth of obsessions, astronomical observatories perched atop towers, laboratories hidden beneath cellars, and entire wings dedicated to his vast collections of curiosities. The emperor's court had ceased to function as a conventional seat of empire. It had become something far more peculiar, a haven for the peculiar itself. Rudolf's Kunstkammer. The cabinet of curiosities stood as a symbol of his approach to rulership. Far more than an elite hobby, it was a cosmological project. Here he gathered not only rare artifacts, but the odd, the obscure, and the grotesque Egyptian mummies, bezoars, narwhal, tusks, antique coins, deformed fetuses preserved in glass, and instruments of surgical precision. The emperor believed that the universe's order could be discovered through its anomalies. Chaos to him was not an aberration, it was a key to divine structure. He collected artworks with manic intensity, acquiring pieces from Titian, Bruegel the Elder, and Dürer. Giuseppe Arcimboldo, the painter who portrayed him as a man made of fruits and vegetables, remained one of Rudolf's closest court artists. His grotesque yet symbolic works were perfectly attuned to Rudolf's worldview metaphor made manifest nature fused with identity. Yet perhaps the most extraordinary element of Rudolf's Prague was the gathering of thinkers and pseudoscientists who orbited his court. Tycho Brahe, the Danish astronomer, renowned for his meticulous planetary observations, arrived in 1599 after a bitter departure from Denmark. He was given generous funding, a home near the castle, and imperial titles. Soon after, Johannes Kepler joined him, setting the stage for one of history's most consequential scientific collaborations, though their partnership was fraught with rivalry and mistrust. Kepler, a devout Lutheran and rigorous mathematician, was initially skeptical of Rudolf's court. He found its esoteric trappings and mystical atmosphere unsettling, but even he was drawn into the emperor's intellectual gravity. In 1601, after Brahe's sudden death, Kepler inherited his mentor's observational data material that would enable him to formulate his laws of planetary motion. Rudolf supported Kepler's work sporadically, but remained more interested in its mystical dimensions than its empirical foundations. Outside the sphere of astronomy, the emperor patronized alchemists with dubious credentials. Edward Kelly, an English alchemist and associate of the occultist John Dee, was among the most infamous. Kelly promised to transmute base metals into gold and to summon angels through his scrying stone. Rudolf granted him titles in a manner captivated by the promise of unlocking eternal life or ultimate wisdom. Even as Kelly's reputation faltered and rumors of fraud spread, Rudolf refused to dismiss him entirely. The court also harbored charlatans who exploited the emperor's belief in prophecy and fate. Astrologers were consulted before state decisions. Horoscopes were drawn up for allies and enemies alike, and when war loomed or plague struck, Rudolf often retreated further into these arcane consultations, believing that signs in the stars could reveal political solutions. Such indulgence in the occult might have been dismissed as eccentricity, were it not for the emperor's growing detachment from imperial governance. Ministers complained of being ignored for weeks. Ambassadors from powerful courts found themselves waiting in Prague for months without an audience. Some left without ever speaking to the emperor at all. The court's internal structure grew opaque. Secretaries competed with astrologers for influence. Financial advisors were undermined by foreign mystics. Decisions were made based not on policy or necessity, but on omens or dreams. The traditional machinery of rule legal frameworks, military planning, diplomatic protocol was sidelined in favor of what one courtier described as a theater of shadows and glass. This did not mean the court lacked innovation. In fact, under Rudolf's patronage, Prague became a center for metallurgy, anatomical studies, botany, and timekeeping. The emperor ordered the construction of mechanical clocks with unprecedented complexity. Inventors brought him devices for measuring atmospheric pressure automata that moved by candle heat and lenses that could magnify the wings of a fly. But the contradiction persisted. The emperor, who supported some of the century's most brilliant minds, also refused to meet with generals as Turkish incursions advanced on Habsburg lands. He hoarded information, dispatched conflicting orders, and resisted any challenge to his authority, even as he delegated real power to trusted aides without accountability. Rudolf's psychological state was by now an open concern among his advisors. He exhibited signs of manic-depressive behavior, enthusiastic engagement one day, near catatonic withdrawal the next. He was known to speak to paintings or remain awake for days in a state of frenetic energy, only to collapse into torpor. Some began to whisper of possession. Others saw a mind breaking under the weight of cosmic ambition. Religion, once a pillar of Habsburg rule, became another battleground of the emperor's conscience. Though Catholic in allegiance, Rudolf resisted direct involvement in Rome's schemes. He expelled some Jesuits while quietly funding Catholic artists. He promoted religious relics yet corresponded with Protestant thinkers. His court remained one of the few in Europe where Protestants and Catholics could converse freely, though more out of the emperor's indifference than any policy of tolerance. In this contradiction lay the essence of Rudolf's haunted court. It was a place of brilliance and delusion, science and mysticism, beauty and bureaucratic paralysis. Prague glowed with creative energy, even as the empire dimmed in administrative neglect. The emperor had built a world in his image cluttered, secretive, intellectually ambitious, and emotionally unstable. But as the court dazzled in one realm, it collapsed in another. The empire, once seen as the protector of Christian Europe, was unraveling not from external conquest, but from within its own center. And still Rudolf remained inside his castle, half king, half alchemist, surrounded by relics, charts, and omens, convinced that the answer to power lay somewhere just beyond the visible world. By the early 1600s, the dazzling veneer of Rudolf II's court in Prague began to crack beneath the strain of deepening political instability and personal decline. What had once seemed like a curious eccentricity, his obsessive reliance on astrologers, his refusal to leave the confines of his castle, now began to raise alarm within the Habsburg dynasty and across the Holy Roman Empire. The emperor's detachment from statecraft had allowed tensions to fester. Now those tensions started to erupt. Religious tensions were foremost among these crises. Rudolf's early alliance with the Catholic League had already alienated the Protestant estates within the empire, especially in Bohemia and the imperial cities of the north. His failure to enforce any consistent policy, sometimes granting rights, sometimes retracting them under pressure, convinced many princes that the emperor could not be trusted. While he had once been seen as a potential unifier, Rudolf now represented confusion and caprice. This instability coincided with an intensification of his psychological deterioration. Observers at court began to speak openly, if quietly, about the emperor's unpredictable behavior. He would isolate himself for weeks, refusing to bathe, refusing to eat, and sometimes issuing contradictory edicts. His mood swings became more pronounced. He lashed out at courtiers, accused trusted advisors of treachery, and developed what many described as persecution delusions. The court's atmosphere darkened accordingly. Fear and rumor filled the halls. Some historians now suspect that Rudolf may have suffered from a form of bipolar disorder, possibly exacerbated by mercury exposure from his alchemical interests. Others point to genetic predisposition, Mental illness ran in certain branches of the Habsburg family, or to the sheer pressure of holding together a fracturing empire during a time of religious upheaval and geopolitical chaos. Whatever the cause, Rudolf's ability to function as emperor was increasingly compromised. Meanwhile, a far more immediate threat to his authority emerged from within his own bloodline. Archduke Matthias, Rudolf's younger brother, had spent years watching the empire drift into dysfunction. A more pragmatic, if less imaginative leader, Matthias began to position himself as a stabilizing alternative. Quietly, he cultivated alliances with the powerful estates of Austria, Hungary, and Moravia regions that had grown resentful of Rudolf's indecision and religious unpredictability. In 1606, this threat became real. Without Rudolf's approval, Matthias negotiated the Peace of Zsitvatarok with the Ottoman Empire, ending the long Turkish War in Hungary. Though a relief to most Habsburg subjects, the treaty was viewed by Rudolf as a direct betrayal. Matthias had acted unilaterally, stepping into imperial jurisdiction without permission. In Rudolf's mind, his brother had not only usurped military command, but had begun to seize the levers of sovereignty. This tension boiled over in 1608 when Matthias marched toward Prague with an army backed by a coalition of disaffected nobles and Protestant leaders. Rudolf, stunned and unprepared, was forced into negotiations. The resulting Treaty of Leoben was a humiliation. Rudolf was compelled to cede control of Austria, Hungary, and Moravia, to Matthias retaining only Bohemia and the titular imperial dignity. For a man obsessed with omens and portents, this division of the Habsburg lands felt like a cosmic unraveling. The loss of authority had personal consequences as well. Rudolf became more reclusive, abandoning even the occasional meetings with advisors. His correspondence dwindled to cryptic orders and anxious pleas. He stopped appearing in public altogether. Only a tight circle of attendants, often selected not for their competence but their docility, were allowed into his private chambers. The emperor's obsessions deepened. He began to hoard items linked to death and decay bones, relics and funerary art. His interest in astrology turned darker as he fixated on apocalyptic predictions. He reportedly believed that he was cursed or possibly bewitched. Visitors described his living quarters as dark, filled with dusty tapestries and unfinished manuscripts. The once vibrant court had begun to resemble a mausoleum. Meanwhile, Bohemia, the last realm under his direct control, grew restless. Protestants there demanded formal recognition of their rights, especially the right to worship freely and maintain their schools and churches. The Letter of Majesty. A document drafted in 1609 was meant to resolve the issue. Under pressure, Rudolf signed it, granting unprecedented religious freedoms to the Bohemian estates. But the emperor quickly regretted this concession. Influenced by Catholic hardliners and his own growing paranoia, Rudolf attempted to undermine the agreement by raising a mercenary army in secret. His plan, known as the Bohemian Plot, was to forcibly suppress the Protestant estates and reassert control. The plan failed spectacularly. His own troops mutinied due to lack of pay, and the Protestant leaders caught wind of the scheme. The betrayal further eroded Rudolf's credibility. With each failure, Rudolf's isolation deepened. Rumors circulated that he believed he was being poisoned. Some claimed he spoke only to statues or conducted nightly seances. Others insisted he no longer recognized his own ministers. While some of these accounts were surely exaggerated, they reflect a broader truth. Rudolf was no longer perceived as fit to rule, even symbolically. And yet his hold on the imperial crown persisted for now. The title of Holy Roman Emperor was not easily revoked, even by family members. It remained a source of dignity, a hollow center around which the rest of the empire reluctantly revolved. Matthias, though effectively in control of most Habsburg territories, hesitated to depose his brother outright. But the situation could not hold forever. The empire was now divided between a ruler unable to govern and a brother unwilling to finish the coup. The imperial court was haunted not just by alchemists and astrologers, but by a very real political vacuum. The costs of Rudolf's reign, both financial and strategic, were mounting. The empire was broke. Religious factions were arming, and Europe was drifting ever closer to what would soon become one of its most devastating conflicts, the 30 Years' War. Though Rudolf would not live to see it, the seeds of that war were sown in the contradictions and chaos of his rule. As the years dragged on into the final stretch of Rudolf II's reign, his world narrowed to a few dimly lit rooms within the sprawling Prague castle. Once the heart of a glittering court that attracted Europe's leading artists and scientists, the emperor's private chambers now echoed with isolation. Courtiers and diplomats once eager to gain imperial favor largely abandoned the halls. What remained was a shadow court filled with anxious retainers, whispering attendants, and the remnants of a monarch's lost grandeur. The emperor's melancholy had by now hardened into something darker and less penetrable. His health deteriorated rapidly. He suffered from gout digestive problems and most likely untreated mental illness. Periods of confusion alternated with bouts of rage. He accused loyal servants of treason, dismissed advisors without cause, and forbade anyone from mentioning Matthias in his presence. Even the few familiar faces who had stood by him, painters, astrologers, musicians, found themselves pushed away. What occupied Rudolf's mind in these years was not policy or diplomacy, but the mysteries of time, death, and destiny. He commissioned new horoscopes, sometimes multiple versions a week. He insisted on the preparation of magical elixirs drawn from obscure alchemical texts. He ordered the exhumation of old corpses from Prague cemeteries, hoping their bones might yield secrets of eternal life. Some accounts describe him inspecting skulls by candlelight, searching their contours for hidden meanings. Outside the castle walls, Bohemia continued to edge toward revolt. The Protestant estates, still embittered over Rudolf's attempt to revoke the Letter of Majesty, began organizing militias. Religious tensions simmered in every corner of the empire. Matthias, now effectively in control of the rest of the Habsburg territories, waited with calculated patience. The world was preparing for war, but inside Prague Castle, time had nearly stopped. Rudolf's household became a mirror of his decline. Letters went unanswered. Ministers operated without consultation. Even imperial messengers who once entered with ceremony and left with sealed decrees often turned back at the castle gates, told that His Imperial Majesty was not receiving anyone, or worse, had fallen into unreadable moods. Meanwhile, Rudolf's physical appearance became emblematic of his fall. Contemporary descriptions report that his hair grew long and tangled his beard unkempt. His skin, once described as pale and delicate, turned ashen. He wore heavy robes even in summer and kept candles burning at all hours. One account noted that he sometimes wandered through his collection halls late at night, speaking to statues and artifacts as if they were counselors. These nocturnal wanderings were not mere eccentricities. They were a symptom of deeper obsession, a final desperate attempt to find meaning and control in a life that had spiraled out of his grasp. He lingered in rooms filled with automata and star charts surrounded by broken instruments and warped mirrors. Where once these tools were employed in scientific inquiry, now they served only as companions in solitude. Those still loyal to Rudolf saw a man slowly fading into delusion. He believed he could delay fate with ritual. He feared not only death, but erasure, the idea that history would forget him. To that end, he redoubled his efforts to preserve his collections, even as Prague's coffers emptied. He refused to fund basic military needs, but paid handsomely for obscure volumes of necromantic lore or ancient astronomical devices from distant lands. It was during this period, around 1601, that Rudolf made one final futile attempt to reclaim authority. Word spread that he had begun assembling another mercenary army to challenge Matthias and retake control of the empire. But there was no money to support such a force. The troops quickly deserted. Whatever remained of Rudolf's reputation collapsed with this failed bid. By now, Matthias was no longer simply an ambitious brother. He had secured recognition from most major territories, and in all but title ruled the empire. Even foreign ambassadors who once navigated Rudolf's erratic moods now traveled directly to Vienna or Bratislava to confer with Matthias. The Holy Roman Emperor was treated as a ceremonial ghost present, but no longer consulted. In May of 1608, Rudolf suffered a minor stroke. His physical condition worsened dramatically in the months that followed. He could barely walk, and his speech grew slurred. The once vibrant man who had conversed with Brahe and Kepler debated color theory with Arcimboldo, and imagined unlocking the secrets of the universe could now barely feed himself. And yet he refused to abdicate. When courtiers gently suggested that perhaps it was time to yield the title, Rudolf responded with fury. In one infamous outburst, he declared that only divine will, not Matthias, not the electors, could strip him of the imperial crown. It was not pride alone that drove him to cling to power, but the belief that stepping down would negate his very identity. To surrender the crown was to admit that all his dreams of transforming the empire into a cosmological wonder had failed. In reality, that transformation had never occurred. Prague under Rudolf had become a monument to what might have been a capital of lost potential, full of beauty and brilliance, but devoid of order. What remained was a court haunted not only by its master's madness, but by the memory of his aspirations. In the end, Rudolf was reduced to a figurehead surrounded by relics. Even his final days passed in confusion. He reportedly ordered his servants to prepare for an audience with the Pope, a figure who had not written to him in years. He muttered about divine signs about a hidden kingdom that would vindicate him. He died on the 20th of January 1690 at the age of 59. The death was quiet and largely unremarked beyond Prague. His body was laid to rest in the Church of St. Vitus. Few mourned him openly. Most were already focused on the conflicts that his reign had failed to prevent. The death of Rudolf II in 1690 marked not just the end of a reign, but the quiet expiration of a peculiar and troubled vision of empire. Though the emperor had technically remained head of the Holy Roman Empire until his final breath power had already passed elsewhere. His younger brother Matthias assumed the imperial title in name shortly after formalizing a transition that had been underway for over a decade. Yet Matthias inherited an empire in peril. The political fragmentation that Rudolf had failed to mend now threatened to erupt into open war. Religious tensions between Protestants and Catholics had sharpened under Rudolf's inconsistent policies, and their long-neglected consequences were now unfolding with force. Across Bohemia, Austria, and the German states, local nobles and imperial cities were forming alliances, arming themselves, and issuing ultimatums. Rudolf's final years had left no viable framework for resolution. He had avoided military confrontation, not from pacifism, but from indecision and distrust. He had failed to broker lasting religious compromises, not from intolerance, but from personal instability. His court's brilliant distraction, its artists, scientists, and esoteric thinkers had obscured but not resolved the deeper crises brewing across his empire. Matthias, pragmatic and more traditionally minded, immediately set about attempting to impose order. He dismissed many of Rudolf's closest associates, disbanded the remnants of the Prague court, and re-centered imperial power in Vienna. His policies were firmer, but the damage had been done. The Bohemian Protestants, who had tasted independence under the protections of the Letter of Majesty, resisted any attempt to curtail their rights. When Matthias moved to restrict their assemblies and schools, tensions flared. By 1618, less than a decade after Rudolf's death, those tensions ignited into open rebellion with the famous Second Defenestration of Prague. Protestant nobles, angered by perceived violations of religious freedoms, threw 2 Catholic royal governors out of a window at Hradčany Castle. This dramatic act did not kill the officials, but it symbolically shattered the fragile equilibrium that Rudolf's rule had left behind. The 30 Years' War had begun. It is no coincidence that the war erupted in Bohemia, Rudolf's final refuge, and the region most directly shaped by his policies. During his rule, Bohemia had experienced both the greatest latitude for religious expression and the greatest confusion about imperial authority. His legacy, uneven and unpredictable, had set the stage for radical responses. The Bohemian Revolt and the larger conflict it triggered would devastate Central Europe for decades and cost millions of lives. Within the Habsburg family, Rudolf was largely treated as an aberration. Matthias and his successors quietly distanced themselves from his court's eccentricities. His patronage of occult sciences and esoteric scholarship was downplayed. Even his substantial support for astronomical innovation was folded into broader narratives of scientific progress stripped of its mystical connotations. The man himself was remembered more as a curiosity than a political figure of consequence. Yet this dismissal overlooks the unique and, in some respects, unprecedented nature of Rudolf's court. While he failed as an emperor in the traditional sense, his court fostered some of the most important intellectual developments of the early modern period. The Rudolphine tables compiled by Kepler using Tycho Brahe's data under Rudolf's sponsorship would become the foundation for later astronomical advances. The Kunstkammer collections, though, dispersed after his death, helped inspire the formation of modern museums and scientific cataloging. Still, the brilliance of his court could not offset the dysfunction of his politics. Rudolf's rule exposed the limits of personality in imperial leadership. The empire's survival depended not only on grandeur or vision, but on continuity, clarity, and the ability to mediate across its fractured landscape. In this, Rudolf had failed profoundly. The machinery of empire had been allowed to seize up its moving parts left to rust, while the emperor turned inward chasing secrets and signs. Rudolf's personal fate was equally ambiguous. He had sought to construct a kingdom of the mind, one that transcended the petty disputes of religion and territory. But the tools he chose, alchemy, astrology, mysticism, proved poor instruments for governing a continent. He mistrusted the very advisors who could have offered pragmatic solutions, and placed his hopes instead in prophecy and ritual. Perhaps the most revealing legacy of Rudolf's decline is what happened to his collections. After his death, Prague was plundered multiple times, first by his successors, then by invading armies. In 1648, at the end of the 30 Years' War, Swedish forces looted the city and carried off much of the Kunstkammer. The mechanical wonders, ancient relics, and esoteric manuscripts he had gathered with such obsession were scattered across Europe. Very little remained in Prague. This dispersal was more than material, it was symbolic. Rudolf's court, so rich in potential, had proven ephemeral. His empire, never fully under control, disintegrated into the longest war of the early modern period. His legacy, once shrouded in wonder and mystery, now stood as a cautionary tale of misplaced priorities and lost opportunities. Rudolf II had dreamed of a hidden order behind the chaos of the world. He had tried to govern not through force or policy, but through the deciphering of signs. In doing so, he abandoned the visible realm for the invisible, and the consequences echoed far beyond his lonely court in Prague. In the aftermath of Rudolf II's death and the disintegration of his Prague court, the remnants of his once grand experiment were dismantled with remarkable speed. The imperial bureaucracy, previously entangled in Rudolf's idiosyncratic habits and personal obsessions, was swiftly restructured under Matthias. The alchemists were dismissed or disappeared, their once prized laboratories shuttered. The astrologers and mystics who had whispered advice in Rudolf's darkened chambers found no place in the more austere, practical administration that followed. But the memory of Rudolf's court lingered not as a model but as a warning. Among historians and scholars, Rudolf became a figure of contradiction. On one hand, he was the Renaissance patron who enabled Johannes Kepler's revolutionary work on planetary motion, and whose support allowed Prague to flourish briefly as a center of European intellectual life. On the other, he was a ruler whose growing paranoia and inaction helped sow the seeds for one of Europe's bloodiest wars. The duality extended into how his successors treated his legacy. Official Habsburg histories minimized Rudolf's reign, portraying him as an unfortunate deviation in the lineage of more competent rulers. The emphasis shifted to Matthias and later Ferdinand II leaders, who supposedly restored Habsburg stability and reasserted Catholic dominance. In this narrative, Rudolf's reign was largely omitted or reduced to a footnote between more serious emperors. Yet Rudolf's Prague remained embedded in cultural memory, if not in official chronicles. Writers, artists, and philosophers returned to the story of the melancholic emperor who had tried to unlock the universe's secrets from his castle's towers. In German-speaking lands especially, Rudolf became a symbol of the uncanny intersection between knowledge and madness. Romantic-era authors in the 19th century would later portray him as a Faustian figure, part visionary, part lunatic, whose downfall stemmed from a desire to comprehend what no mortal should. Meanwhile, traces of his vast collections continued to resurface in unexpected places. Some of the scientific instruments and artworks confiscated during the Swedish occupation of Prague in 1648 found their way into Stockholm's Royal Armoury and museums. Others were sold off by agents of Matthias or looted in later wars. The once coherent vision behind the Kunstkammer dissolved its parts, scattered across a continent that had little use for Rudolf's philosophy of wonder. But perhaps the most enduring element of Rudolf's reign was not in what he built, but in what he failed to do. His inability or refusal to confront the empire's religious divide left the Holy Roman Empire politically paralyzed at a moment of great urgency. His refusal to forge alliances to articulate a consistent policy or to adapt to a rapidly changing political landscape allowed centrifugal forces to gain momentum. By turning inward, Rudolf inadvertently turned the empire outward toward revolt, fragmentation, and war. What's striking is how fully Rudolf embodied the tensions of his age. He lived at a crossroads of medieval belief and early modern science, of empire and autonomy, of magic and method. Few rulers attempted to straddle these divides as boldly as he did, and fewer still failed as profoundly. His personal decline mirrored the crumbling order of the late 16th century Holy Roman Empire. His court, for all its brilliance, became a microcosm of a larger political entropy. Kepler, one of the few who remained loyal even after the court's collapse, recognized the contradiction. He mourned Rudolf's fall, but also acknowledged the costs of his intellectual aloofness. In later writings, Kepler would describe Rudolf as a prince who desired knowledge above all things, but not governance. That observation, though sympathetic, captures the core of the emperor's failure. In a role that demanded compromise, communication, and clarity, Rudolf pursued mysticism, purity, and isolation. Despite this, the emperor's shadow continued to haunt Central Europe. The outbreak of the 30 Years' War in 1618 was not solely Rudolf's doing, but it emerged from conditions his reign had exacerbated. His court's religious ambiguity, his patronage of conflicting theological camps, and his indecisiveness on matters of principle left a vacuum. When that vacuum collapsed, it did so violently. And yet there remains something compelling, almost tragic in Rudolf's vision. In an age of religious absolutism and dynastic rigidity, he imagined an alternative model of Rule 1, grounded in the pursuit of hidden truths, in the integration of science and art, and in the rejection of militaristic conquest. That it failed does not mean it lacked value. Rather, it suggests that the world Rudolf tried to build was out of step with the one he inherited. The final insult to Rudolf's memory came not from the collapse of his policies, but from the forgetting of his intent. As war consumed Europe, the intellectual treasures he had supported were put to other uses. Astronomical tables, repurposed for artillery calculations, alchemical texts treated as heresy, and mechanical marvels melted down for coinage or cannon fittings. What had once been a court of curiosity became a footnote in the long history of empire and collapse. Rudolf's haunted court, in the end, had not only been haunted by spirits and prophecies, it had been haunted by the ghost of a different kind of future. One that never materialized. The long decline of Rudolf II culminated not in a dramatic fall from power, but in a slow unraveling of empire, of court, and of self. His death in 1690 marked a quiet close to one of the most peculiar reigns in the history of the Holy Roman Empire. Yet even after his passing, the consequences of his choices and of his indecisions continued to ripple outward. In Bohemia, the Letter of Majesty remained a symbol of religious autonomy, one that Protestant leaders clung to as their last legal safeguard against imperial centralization. But Rudolf's belated concession, issued during a moment of political desperation, had lacked real enforcement mechanisms. When Matthias and later Ferdinand II attempted to roll back those freedoms, the resulting backlash sparked the Bohemian Revolt, and soon after the 30 Years' War. The constitutional uncertainty left by Rudolf's vacillations helped justify rebellion on both sides. In many respects, Rudolf's reign serves as a case study in the dangers of personalized rule within a system that depended on shared governance. The Holy Roman Empire was a delicate structure of overlapping jurisdictions, elective authority, and negotiated compromise. It demanded from its emperor not omniscience, but orchestration, a willingness to navigate between religious factions, princely interests, and foreign threats. Rudolf, however, retreated from those responsibilities. He turned inward into metaphysical speculation, psychological torment, and the pursuit of cosmic order through material symbols. That withdrawal, though, did not render him passive. In his own way, Rudolf was a deeply active monarch, just not in the ways that history tends to reward. He was active in patronage, in collecting, in thinking. He sought to understand the natural world, to collect its anomalies, to read its patterns like scripture. And in doing so, he attracted a remarkable array of talents: Kepler, Brahe, Archimboldo, Spranger. The scientific and artistic achievements that emerged under his watch were in some cases centuries ahead of their time. But Rudolf failed to translate this intellectual vision into political coherence. His Prague court became a place of paradox, a beacon of Enlightenment curiosity wrapped in late medieval superstition, a center of artistic patronage amid administrative decay, a court of learning enclosed within a fortress of fear. His mental health remains a matter of historical speculation. The accounts vary: melancholia, paranoia, possibly manic depressive illness exacerbated by mercury exposure from alchemical experiments. Regardless of diagnosis, the effect was visible. The emperor trusted fewer people as time went on. He issued fewer decrees, took fewer meetings, and viewed political developments as extensions of mystical destiny. By the final decade of his reign, he had effectively ceased to govern. What Rudolf could not grasp, perhaps refused to grasp, was that the empire was changing. The balance between faith and reason, between central authority and local privilege, between the old universalism of the medieval world and the rising particularism of the early modern states, was shifting. While he attempted to build a court that transcended these pressures, the world beyond Prague had no patience for metaphysical experiments. That disconnect is perhaps what ultimately made Rudolf's court feel haunted. It was haunted not by literal spirits, but by the gap between ideals and outcomes, between intellect and power. Those who passed through it, scientists, artists, courtiers left, changed, sometimes enlightened, sometimes disillusioned. Those who governed outside of it, however, saw it as an eccentric distraction from the growing storm. Today, Rudolf II remains a contested figure in history. In scientific circles, his court is remembered as a unique moment of patronage. In political history, he is often cited as a weak and erratic emperor whose inaction contributed to one of Europe's worst conflicts. In cultural studies, he appears as a liminal figure, a man perched between worlds, embodying the tensions of a continent on the cusp of modernity. Few rulers have left such an uneven legacy. Few failed so visibly in their formal duties while leaving behind so much intellectual and artistic wealth. And fewer still have become so completely overshadowed by the wars that followed them. But perhaps Rudolf's tragedy lies not in what he did or did not do, but in the type of king he tried to be, one who ruled not by the sword or the ledger, but by the stars. And in a world increasingly ruled by gunpowder doctrine and cash, there was little room left for such a monarch. The reign of Rudolf II stands as one of the most enigmatic chapters in the history of early modern Europe. It was a time suspended between eras, caught between the certainties of the medieval world and the unsettling emergence of scientific modernity. At its center stood a ruler both brilliant and broken, determined to shape his empire through knowledge rather than command, and undone by the very isolation his vision demanded. Rudolf's Prague court offered a fleeting glimpse of what might have been a crucible of art science and mysticism, coexisting in pursuit of deeper truth. Yet without the scaffolding of political stability and religious coherence, that vision was doomed to fragment. The institutions he neglected did not hold. The crises he ignored did not abate. And the empire he was meant to guide fractured in his absence. His personal descent into melancholy and paranoia mirrors the fate of the Holy Roman Empire itself, an entity that became increasingly dysfunctional as the demands of unity outpaced the capacity of its leaders to provide it. When the 30 Years' War finally erupted, it was less a sharp break from the past than the logical endpoint of imperial drift, set in motion in part by Rudolf's failure to act. And yet, in his strange and haunted court, Rudolf left behind something more enduring than political power, a testament to the human longing for order in chaos, meaning in matter and transcendence in rule. His legacy is not that of a conqueror or reformer, but of a man who tried against all odds to govern the heavens from earth. In the end, Rudolf II did not lose his empire in a single moment. He let it slip away, one silence, one obsession, one unread letter at a time.